Story number 1.
There was something off about the small town of Pinehurst, but it was subtle, something you couldn't quite put your finger on. The old town felt like it had been forgotten by time, as though the world had moved on, leaving it behind to decay in silence. For Emily, it was an escape. She'd been running from her past for years. Bad decisions, a failed relationship, the death of a loved one, and Pinehurst seemed to offer the peace and solitude she so desperately needed. She found an old house for rent at the edge of town, far from the few scattered shops and homes. The realtor had warned her that the house had been empty for years, but she was too tired to care. It was cheap, it was quiet, and it was hers. The small cottage, though dilapidated, still had a charm to it. The wooden beams creaked under the weight of its history. And the wallpaper inside looked like it had once been beautiful, though faded and peeling now. Emily loved the silence. The occasional chirp of crickets at night, the rustling of leaves when the wind picked up, and the deep, calm stillness of the town that made it feel like time moved slower here. She spent her days unpacking, reorganizing the rooms, and cleaning what she could. It wasn't until the third night that something happened. She had settled into a routine: dinner, reading a book by candlelight, and going to bed early. The nights were the hardest for her. It was when her mind would race, when memories from her past would come flooding back. But that night, something was different. She had just turned off the light and was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when she heard a soft knock at her bedroom door. She froze. No one was supposed to be here. She was alone. The knock came again, this time louder, more deliberate. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her heart began to race. "Hello?" She called out quietly, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She stayed still, listening for any sound that would explain the knock, but nothing came. She slowly got out of bed, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor. The house groaned under her weight as she moved toward the door. Her hand hovered over the handle for a moment, unsure whether she should open it or not. But when the door swung open, it revealed nothing. There was no one on the other side. Emily stepped out into the hallway, her senses heightened, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hallway was empty, just the darkened walls and the distant flicker of the dim light from the staircase below. She walked slowly toward the staircase, wondering if she might have imagined the knocking. Maybe it was the house settling. But then she heard it again. It was faint at first, like someone whispering just out of earshot. She paused, straining to hear. The whispering came again, louder this time. It sounded like a voice, low and raspy, a voice that didn't belong to anyone she knew. It seemed to come from below, from the darkness of the stairs. Emily backed away slowly, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had heard. Could it be the wind? Was it the house, creaking and groaning in the night? She didn't know, but she couldn't ignore the sense of dread that was slowly creeping up on her. She returned to her bedroom, locking the door behind her, but even as she lay back down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The air felt thick, charged with an unease she couldn't explain. The next day, Emily tried to brush it off. It was an old house. Old houses made strange noises. But when she went into town to run errands, she noticed people staring at her. They weren't friendly stares either. There was a hint of something darker in their eyes, something that made her feel like an intruder in her own skin. She didn't know what to make of it, but the stares made her uncomfortable. Later that evening, she returned to the house, feeling more and more like she didn't belong. As the sun set, she heard the whispering again, but this time it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from within the walls. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. The walls seemed to hum with the whispers of someone or something lurking just beyond her reach. She tried to ignore it, tried to go about her business, but the sound was relentless. It followed her, taunting her, until she could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. She went to the basement, hoping to find an explanation. The basement was dark, cold, and smelled of mildew, but there was a strange heaviness in the air, like something had been trapped there for a long time. The floorboards creaked as she stepped further into the room, and the whispering grew louder. It wasn't until she saw it that she understood. At the far end of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of old boxes, was a door. It wasn't much to look at, just an old wooden door, faded and cracked with age. But there was something about it, something that made her stomach churn when she looked at it. She stepped closer, her feet feeling as though they were moving of their own accord. She reached for the doorknob, but as her hand made contact, a surge of cold rushed through her. The whispers grew louder, now more frantic, pleading. Without thinking, she turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange markings. But what caught her attention, what made her blood run cold, was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was a man. No, not a man. Something else. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and empty, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that sent a shiver down her spine. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his body thin and emaciated, as if he had been trapped there for years. Emily stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that made the house shake. The man in the room stepped forward, his eyes locked onto hers, his smile widening. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice a hoarse whisper that seemed to echo in her mind. "This house belongs to me now." Emily ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. She tore up the stairs, her breath ragged, but no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was chasing her. The whispers grew louder, louder still, until they filled her ears, drowning out everything else. She reached her bedroom, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air. But the whispers didn't stop. That night, Emily didn't sleep. She couldn't. The man, or whatever he was, haunted her thoughts. She could still hear his voice, the way it reverberated in her mind, pulling her deeper into his web. She knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She had to leave. The next morning, she packed up everything she could carry, but when she stepped outside, she found that the town had changed. The streets were empty, the houses dark and abandoned, as though the entire town had been swallowed up by the night. She turned back to the house, her heart racing, but when she looked at it, she saw something in the window, his face, staring back at her, his grin never fading. Emily never spoke about what happened in Pinehurst to anyone. The house was abandoned again, just as it had been before, but no one ever mentioned it. It was as if it had never existed. But every now and then, when she closed her eyes, she could hear the whispers, faint but growing louder, and she knew that he was still out there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It started as a normal night. Claire was used to working late at the small gas station off Route 49, where the lights flickered, and the parking lot always smelled like damp asphalt. The place was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, and the only company she usually had was the occasional trucker stopping in for coffee or cigarettes. That night, it was different. She noticed him right away. He was standing at pump number 4, not moving, just staring at the store. The security cameras showed a grainy image of him, tall and thin, his face obscured by a hood. He wasn't pumping gas, he wasn't even near a car, just standing, watching. Claire swallowed hard and looked away, forcing herself to focus on organizing the scratch-off tickets by the register. The clock read 2:37 a.m. The store was quiet, except for the dull hum of the overhead lights and the occasional rustle of leaves from outside. She glanced up again. He was gone. Relief washed over her, but only for a second. Something about the situation made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way he had just disappeared so suddenly. Maybe it was the way the cameras had flickered for just a moment before he vanished. She shook off the feeling and busied herself with counting the cigarettes behind the counter. That's when the chime on the door rang. Her stomach dropped. The man walked in, his steps slow, deliberate. His hoodie was still up, casting a shadow over his face. He was wearing an old, oversized jacket, the kind that looked like it had been dragged through the mud. "Hey," Claire said cautiously, forcing a polite smile. "Can I help you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he walked straight past the counter and toward the back of the store, where the coolers held beer and soda. Claire watched him on the security screen, but something was wrong. His reflection didn't show up in the cooler's glass door. She blinked. Maybe it was just the glare. The man stayed there for far too long, just standing in front of the coolers. Claire's fingers hovered over the emergency button under the register. She had dealt with strange customers before, but something about this one was wrong. Then, without warning, the power cut out. The store was swallowed in darkness. Claire gasped, her breath hitching in her throat. The emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie, dim glows across the aisles. The man was gone. Claire's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She grabbed the flashlight from beneath the counter, clicking it on with shaky hands. The backup power should have kept the cameras running, but when she checked the monitor, the screens were black. The air felt thick, suffocating. She took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the counter, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. She moved cautiously, her sneakers making soft squeaks against the tile floor. When she reached the back of the store, the cooler door was wide open, a trail of condensation dripping onto the floor, but the man wasn't there. A cold breeze brushed against her neck. She spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The aisles were empty. The front door was locked. She had locked it earlier. There was no way he could have left. Her breathing quickened as she backed toward the counter. She reached for the landline phone, but before she could grab it, something whispered in her ear. A single word. "Run." Claire screamed. She stumbled backward, knocking over a display of snack bags. The whisper had been so close, as if someone had been standing right behind her. She whirled around, but there was nothing. Her hands fumbled to grab the phone. It was dead. The emergency lights flickered again. Then she heard it. A scraping sound. Slow, deliberate. It was coming from the ceiling. Claire tilted her head up, her breath caught in her throat. The ceiling tiles above aisle 3 shifted slightly. Something was up there. She took a step back, barely suppressing the sob rising in her chest. The scraping continued. Then, a soft thud. Something landed behind her. Claire didn't turn around. She ran. She sprinted for the back office, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her hands trembled as she searched for her cell phone, which she had left charging on the desk. When she found it, the screen was already on. A message notification blinked. "Unknown number, I see you." Claire dropped the phone. She pressed her back against the door, her heart hammering. The store was silent again, but she knew she wasn't alone. Then the doorknob turned. Slowly, Claire clamped a hand over her mouth, choking back a sob. The knob twisted back and forth, testing the lock. Then a single knock. A deep, deliberate knock. And then another. Knock, knock, knock. Each knock sent a jolt of terror through her. Then the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. She didn't move, she didn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as the power had gone out, the lights flickered back on. Claire stayed frozen. She didn't dare move until she was sure. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, as the sun began to rise, she gathered the courage to leave the office. The store was exactly as it had been before. The coolers were shut. The aisles were undisturbed. Even the security screens were back on, playing their usual grainy footage. But when she checked the cameras, the footage for the past 3 hours was missing, as if it had never happened. Claire quit that morning. She never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when she drives past Path gas station, she swears she still sees him, standing by pump number 4, watching, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The house wasn't special. It wasn't haunted, wasn't old, didn't have some dark history. It was just a house, a regular suburban home in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked during the day and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. That's why it didn't make sense. Kara moved in with her fiancé, Daniel, 3 months before everything started. It was a cozy little place, a single-story house with a small backyard and a big oak tree that cast shade over most of the lawn. They were happy, busy planning their wedding, and Kara had just started a new remote job, which meant she was home alone during the day. It began with small things. The first time she noticed something off, she had just finished a video meeting and went to the kitchen to make coffee. She always kept her keys on a hook by the door, but they weren't there. She checked her purse, the counter, even the fridge in case she had absent-mindedly put them in there. Nothing. Frustrated, she called Daniel, who swore he hadn't touched them. After nearly an hour of searching, she finally found them in the backyard, lying in the grass beneath the oak tree. She had no memory of going outside that morning. The second time, it was the front door. Kara had a habit of double-checking the locks at night. She was paranoid about security. always making sure everything was bolted before she went to bed. But one morning, when she got up to make coffee, the door was wide open. She stood frozen, the cool morning air creeping into the house. She checked the locks. They weren't broken. No signs of forced entry. Daniel insisted it must have been her. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she didn't close it all the way. But she knew she had. Then came the scratching. It started around midnight, faint at first. Kara would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced she had imagined it. Scritch, scritch, scritch. A slow, deliberate sound like nails dragging across wood. She thought it was mice at first. They called an exterminator, who found nothing. No droppings, no holes, no sign of pests. He assured them the house was fine. That night, the scratching came back. But this time, it wasn't coming from inside the walls. It was coming from under the bed. Kara didn't move. She didn't even breathe. Her fingers tightened around the blanket as she listened. Scritch! Scritch! A slow, deliberate scrape against the wooden floor beneath her. Daniel was fast asleep beside her, completely unaware. Then the mattress shifted. Something was underneath. Kara's breath hitched, her entire body going cold. She wanted to move, to wake Daniel, to run, but she was frozen, locked in place by some primal fear she couldn't explain. Then the scratching stopped. The room was silent. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, she convinced herself she had imagined it. Maybe it was stress. Maybe she had been half asleep. The next morning, she checked under the bed. Nothing. But just as she was about to leave the room, something caught her eye. A single long scratch was carved into the wooden floor. The next few nights, it got worse. Footsteps in the hall when she was home alone. Soft breathing just outside the bedroom door. Daniel never heard it. He slept through everything. He laughed it off, told her she was probably dreaming. But she wasn't. One night, she woke up to the feeling of someone watching her. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Her eyes adjusted slowly, and that's when she saw it. The closet door was open. Just a crack. She never left it open. A chill ran down her spine. She couldn't see anything inside, just blackness. Then, in the silence, she heard it. A whisper. Not words. Just a sound. Soft. Almost like laughter. She reached over, shaking Daniel awake. "What?" he mumbled. She pointed to the closet, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's open." Daniel sighed and rolled over. "Go back to sleep, Kara." She didn't. The next day, she bought a lock for the closet. But the night after that, something happened that she couldn't explain away. Kara had been up late working on a project. She shut her laptop around 2 a.m. and decided to grab a glass of water before bed. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard it. Footsteps. Soft, slow, coming from the living room. Her heart pounded. Daniel was asleep. She knew that. She stood there, gripping the edge of the doorframe, barely breathing. Then the footsteps stopped. A long silence stretched through the house. Then a whisper. Low, raspy, just at the edge of hearing. "I see you." Kara slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she told Daniel everything. Every sound, every movement, every moment of pure terror she had experienced over the past few weeks. He was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he admitted something. "I didn't want to scare you," he said, rubbing a hand over his face. "But I've heard things too." Kara stared at him. "The night you woke me up about the closet, I saw it too. The door moving. But I didn't want to say anything." Kara's skin prickled. "Why?" she whispered. Daniel hesitated. "Because I thought if we ignored it, it would go away." That was the last night they stayed in the house. They packed their things in a frenzy, booking a hotel while they searched for a new place. But before they left, Kara did one last thing. She placed her phone on the bedroom floor, camera facing the bed, and hit record. She let it run overnight. The next morning, she retrieved it. Her hands shook as she pressed play. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Just the usual darkness, the occasional flicker of headlights passing outside. Then around 3 a.m., the screen glitched. For a split second, the screen went black. Then it came back, and something was different. The closet door was open. A shadow moved across the room. Not walking. Crawling. It slid from the closet, like its limbs long and unnatural, dragging itself toward the bed. Then it stopped. For a moment, it was still. Then it slowly lifted its head. Kara's blood ran cold. She could see its face. It had no eyes, just hollow, empty sockets. But it was looking right at the camera. The screen glitched again. Then the video ended. Kara never went back. She doesn't know who or what was in that house with them. But sometimes in the middle of the night, when she's in bed in her new home, she still hears it. Scritch, scritch, a slow, deliberate scratching beneath the bed. Waiting, watching. Story the end.
Story number 4.
In a small, nondescript town, tucked away in the woods, there was a house known only to a few. The kind of house that seemed to loom over everything around it, its silhouette casting an eerie shadow over the quiet street. It was a decaying relic, an old Victorian home, its dark windows always seeming to reflect more than the weather, its creaky boards and sagging roof suggesting a long-forgotten history. To most people in town, the house was just a piece of the scenery, a building no one cared to think about. Until one cold winter night, everything changed. Maria had recently moved into the town, hoping to leave behind the bustling city life and escape to a quieter existence. She had always been drawn to quiet places, peaceful, undisturbed environments where she could write, relax, and reflect on her life. She found a small, modest apartment not far from the woods and settled in quickly, charmed by the tranquility that seemed to surround her. The first few weeks were perfect. The air smelled clean and crisp, the streets were lined with snow-covered trees, and the hum of the world outside barely touched the calm inside her new home. It was only after a month of living there that she started hearing rumors about the house. At first, it was nothing more than casual conversation. The woman at the coffee shop mentioned it in passing while handing Maria her latte, speaking of it like a ghost story told over drinks on a lazy night. "That old house on Maple Street," she said, "they say it's been empty for years. But some people claim it's never really been abandoned. People say they hear things. Strange sounds late at night. I wouldn't go near it if I were you." Maria had laughed it off, intrigued more by the locals' ability to spin stories than by any real fear. After all, it was just a house, right? Old houses creak. Old houses groan. It was the natural decay of things. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. Days passed, and she found herself walking by the house more often, taking a longer route when she left the grocery store or the post office. The house was larger than she'd expected, the kind of place that would have been grand in its time, elegant, full of history, and hidden away behind thick trees. But now, its paint was chipped, the windows broken or covered in dust. The yard had long since surrendered to weeds and overgrowth, as if nature itself had chosen to reclaim what was once human-made. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Maria found herself standing across the street from the house, her eyes fixed on the darkened windows. She wasn't sure why she was there. Something had drawn her, some strange feeling, almost like an invisible pull. The street was quiet, the air still, no sounds except for the distant hum of the wind against the branches. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic thud, like footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around, expecting to see someone walking along the road, but no one was there. The street was empty, and yet the sound continued. A faint tap, 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 as though someone was walking inside the house, their feet shuffling on the creaky floors. Maria stood frozen, watching the house. The sound of footsteps faded, replaced by a low creaking noise, as if something heavy had shifted inside. She felt a sudden chill, a shiver running down her spine. Maybe it was just the wind, or the house settling, she thought. But it didn't feel like that. It felt different, like something or someone was trying to get out. With a hesitant breath, she turned and walked away, but the feeling of being watched lingered with her. That night, she lay in bed, the image of the house stuck in her mind, the footsteps, the creaking. Something about it felt wrong. Over the next few days, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something she didn't understand. Her dreams became restless, filled with images of the house, dark, oppressive, and somehow alive. She would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, and feel the weight of something pressing down on her chest. But when she looked around, there was nothing there. She tried to distract herself with her writing, but even that couldn't keep her mind from wandering back to the house. There was an undeniable pull, as if the house was calling to her, beckoning her to uncover its secrets. One afternoon, while walking through the woods behind her apartment, Maria saw a man sitting on a bench near the edge of the clearing. He looked familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen him before. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, but he wore a slight smile as though he was content with the world around him. As she approached, he glanced up at her, his smile widening. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken in years. Maria nodded politely, unsure of how to respond. The man's smile never faltered, and he continued to stare at her with those hollow eyes, as though waiting for something. "You've seen the house, haven't you?" he asked, his tone suddenly changing. It was almost like he knew her thoughts. Maria stiffened, unsure of what to say. "The old one on Maple Street?" she replied cautiously. "Yes," the man said, his smile now tinged with something darker. "It's not as empty as people think. There's something inside, something waiting." Maria swallowed, suddenly feeling a surge of unease. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not abandoned. Not really. People have gone in there, and some never came out. Others came back. Changed. It feeds on the curious. It feeds on the lonely." His words sent a shiver through Maria, and before she could respond, the man stood up and walked away, disappearing into the woods as quietly as he had appeared. Maria stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Had he been warning her? Or had he simply been another part of the town's strange fabric, one of the many eccentricities that lived there? That night, she couldn't resist. She found herself standing in front of the house again, drawn as if by some invisible force. The street was empty, the house even darker than before. The windows seemed to watch her, and as she took a step closer, she heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps, slower now, deliberate. She was close now, just a few feet from the front door. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen. She reached out and touched the doorknob, its metal cold against her skin. A surge of electricity shot through her fingers, as though something alive had stirred within the walls. With a deep breath, she turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty hallway. The air inside was stale, as though the house hadn't been disturbed in years. A long staircase wound its way up to the second floor, where shadows seemed to dance along the walls. Maria hesitated, but curiosity won out. She stepped inside. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The floorboards groaned under her feet as she walked down the hallway, drawn to the room at the end. There, in the dim light, she saw something that made her heart stop. It was a figure, slender, pale, and standing in the corner of the room. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, some kind of strange art piece, but then it moved. Its head turned slowly, impossibly, until its hollow eyes locked onto hers. Maria gasped, taking a step back. The figure tilted its head, its lips curling into a smile, and then, without warning, it began to move toward her. The house seemed to close in around her. The air was thick, suffocating, and the sound of footsteps grew louder, now echoing in the halls as though 1,000 people were walking toward her. The floor beneath her feet buckled, and the walls seemed to close in. Maria ran, heart pounding, her mind screaming for her to get out. She rushed down the hallway, toward the door, but it slammed shut in front of her with a deafening crash. The shadows grew darker, thicker, and the whispers started again. They were everywhere, all around her, calling her name. In that moment, Maria realized the truth. The house wasn't empty. It had never been empty, and it was hungry. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was just an ordinary house, nestled quietly in a sleepy suburban neighborhood, but something about it always felt different to Sandra. Perhaps it was the way the trees seemed to lean toward it, their bare branches looking like twisted fingers, or the way the windows appeared almost too dark, too silent, as though they were hiding something. Sandra had moved into the house a few weeks ago, fresh from a divorce, hoping for a fresh start. The house was small, older, and slightly worn, but it fit her budget and the price was right. She didn't mind a little work. She was used to doing things on her own now. For the first few days, the house felt warm enough, albeit quiet. It was a typical mid-century home, nothing spectacular, but comfortable in its own way. She spent her time unpacking boxes, cleaning, and getting to know the neighborhood. The people she met were nice enough, though there was always something just a little off about their smiles, like they were holding back something they didn't want her to know. The first strange thing happened during her third night in the house. It was a cold evening, the kind that had her wrapped in a sweater as she sat in the living room reading a book. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. She was used to old houses making noises, so when she heard a soft thud from upstairs, she didn't think much of it. It was probably just the house settling. But then it came again, another soft thud followed by a scraping sound. Sandra set her book down and listened. The sounds were muffled but unmistakable. Someone was walking around upstairs, but she was alone. She was certain of it. She had been alone all day, no visitors, no one else living in the house. Her heartbeat quickened as she stood up and walked cautiously to the stairs. She paused at the bottom, looking up into the darkness at the top of the stairs. The house was old, so it wasn't unusual for it to creak. But these sounds, these weren't the normal creaks of an old house. These were deliberate. Someone or something was moving around up there. Her mind raced. Should she call the police? No, she told herself. That would be ridiculous. There had to be some reasonable explanation. She was imagining things. Taking a deep breath, Sandra slowly made her way upstairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the house itself was urging her to stop. She reached the top of the stairs and everything went eerily quiet. The air felt thick and cold, and for a moment, Sandra almost convinced herself she had imagined the sounds. But then she heard it again, another thud, this time much closer, almost right behind her. Her blood froze in her veins. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her hand gripped the railing as she glanced down the long, narrow hallway. The old wooden floors seemed to groan under her weight as she moved forward. The first door on the left was slightly ajar, the faintest bit of light leaking out. Sandra hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The room was empty, nothing more than an old guest room with a simple bed and an antique dresser. But something about it made her skin crawl. The air felt heavier in there, as though the room had been holding its breath for years. She shook her head. She was being ridiculous. She was just tired, that's all. The divorce, the move, the stress, it was all taking its toll. She needed to get some rest. As she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. On the far wall near the corner, there was a small, faint mark, almost like a smudge, but too perfectly shaped to be just dirt. It was dark, a deep reddish-brown color, and it looked like it had been there for a long time. Her breath hitched in her throat. Sandra knew in that moment that she wasn't alone in the house. Someone, or something, was watching her. Shaking off the unease crawling up her spine, she quickly closed the door and made her way back downstairs, her pulse still racing. She locked all the doors and windows before retreating to her bedroom, but sleep eluded her that night. Her mind kept wandering back to that strange mark on the wall. What could it have been? The next day, Sandra decided to go out and get some fresh air. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, but she needed to clear her mind. As she walked down the tree-lined street, she met a couple of neighbors, and while they were polite, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, sizing her up in a way that made her uncomfortable. One woman, an older lady with silver hair, asked Sandra how she was settling in, then followed it with a strange question. "You're not hearing any noises, are you?" The woman asked, her voice soft, almost conspiratorial. Sandra blinked in surprise. "No, I haven't heard anything strange." The woman gave her a knowing smile, but there was something unsettling about it, like she knew something Sandra didn't. "You might. It's an old house," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They can be unpredictable." Before Sandra could respond, the woman turned and walked away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, more confused than ever. Had the woman been hinting at something? Or was it just another piece of small-town gossip? That night, Sandra decided to investigate. She couldn't let the strange happenings go on without getting to the bottom of it. She dug through some boxes and found an old flashlight. Her heart pounded as she made her way back upstairs. She had to see what was really going on in that room. This time, when she opened the door, the room seemed colder, much colder than before. The light flickered as she stepped inside, shining on the far wall. The smudge was still there, but now it looked worse. It was larger, more pronounced, like it had spread. And there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible trail leading from the mark toward the back of the room. Sandra's stomach turned. She felt a cold sweat form on the back of her neck as she followed the trail. It led her to an old dresser. Something about it felt wrong, out of place in the otherwise empty room. Her hand shook as she reached out and opened the top drawer. Inside was a small, weathered notebook. She opened it cautiously, flipping through the pages. The writing inside was erratic, the words hastily scrawled, almost as though the person who wrote them was in a hurry, or maybe afraid. One entry caught her eye. It read, "I hear them at night. They want me to join them. They want me to be like them." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. She flipped through more pages, each one darker and more frantic than the last, until she came to a final, chilling sentence. "The house will never let me leave." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. Sandra's heart leapt into her throat as she slammed the notebook shut and rushed down the stairs. She knew, without a doubt, that she wasn't alone. Something was in the house with her, something that had been there for far longer than she had. The living room was dark, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Sandra's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the noise. Her gaze landed on the window. The blinds were swaying slightly as though someone had just passed by them, but there was no one outside. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing in the doorway leading to the kitchen. It was tall, thin, and dressed in tattered clothes. Its face was gaunt, hollow, its eyes empty pits of darkness. Sandra froze, terror coursing through her veins as the figure stepped forward, its movement unnaturally slow and deliberate. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. In that moment, the figure reached out a hand and everything went black. When Sandra woke, it was morning. The house was still. No footsteps, no whispers. The air was heavy with an unsettling calm. But she knew something was wrong, something she couldn't explain. And as she glanced back toward the stairs, she saw it again, the faint mark on the wall, now larger, spreading farther across the room. The house was not empty, not by a long shot. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I still remember the house, not because of its size or its odd creaks and groans, but because of what happened when I moved in. At the time, I had no idea that what seemed like a fresh start would soon turn into a living nightmare. I was in my mid-20s, fresh out of college, and desperate to escape the suffocating grip of city life. So, when I found a little cottage for rent, tucked away in the woods just outside town, I thought it was the perfect solution. It was small, charming, and completely isolated, an ideal setting for quiet reflection and recharging after years of stress and distractions. I was ready to build a new life, to reconnect with nature and escape the chaos I'd lived in for so long. The owner of the cottage was an elderly woman named Margaret. She had a slight limp and a quiet, watchful demeanor, but she seemed kind enough. I signed the lease quickly, eager to move in. Margaret warned me that the house had been in her family for generations, and while it wasn't the most modern place, it had good bones. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first few days went smoothly. The house, although old, was comfortable. The surrounding forest provided a serene backdrop that helped me unwind. But there was something off about the place, a subtle, almost imperceptible unease that hung in the air. At night, the woods would go silent, like the creatures themselves held their breath. And when I lay in bed, the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, just beyond my field of vision. One evening, I was sitting on the front porch, reading a book, when I noticed something strange. A figure stood near the edge of the tree line, just within the darkness. It was too far for me to make out clearly, but it looked like a man, tall, hunched over slightly, with a wide-brimmed hat. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It simply stood there, motionless. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I had imagined it. But when I looked again, the figure was still there. A chill crept up my spine as I felt my heartbeat quicken. I didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't want to stay out there any longer. I quickly closed the door behind me and retreated inside, locking the door with trembling hands. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing at the edge of the trees. My mind ran through all sorts of possibilities. Maybe it was just someone walking through the woods, maybe a local trying to get to the nearby town, or maybe, just maybe, it wasn't human at all. The next day, I tried to push the strange encounter out of my mind. But as I went about my daily routine, I started noticing more oddities. The wind would carry strange sounds. Whispers, almost, but when I stopped to listen, they were gone. The lights inside the house would flicker randomly, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The worst part, though, was the feeling of being watched. No matter where I went in the house, it felt like someone was just out of sight, waiting. I began to feel restless, as if I was no longer alone in the house. One evening, after returning from a long walk through the woods, I decided to take a bath to relax. I filled the tub, letting the warm water soothe my aching muscles. But just as I was about to settle in, I heard a faint knock at the door. I froze, soap still in my hands. Knock, knock. I didn't move. The knock was too deliberate, too soft to be from a passerby. No one ever came to visit me. I had no neighbors for miles, and the road leading up to the house was barely used. The knocking continued, steady and unyielding. I felt my stomach drop as a sense of dread washed over me. I didn't know what to do. Should I ignore it? Should I answer? I stood, quickly wrapping a towel around myself, and made my way to the front door. I peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. No person, no shadow, just an empty porch. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. Shaking, I returned to the bathroom, but something had changed. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for me. I kept my eyes on the door, half expecting it to burst open, but nothing happened. I decided to leave the house for a while. I needed to clear my head, to figure out if I was just imagining things. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, locking it behind me. I wasn't sure where I was going, just somewhere, anywhere, away from that suffocating house. But when I returned a few hours later, I noticed something immediately. The door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. I always locked it. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence inside the house was deafening. As I moved through the rooms, I noticed that nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing. The mirror in the hallway was slightly tilted, as if someone had touched it. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. For the next few days, the incidents escalated. Objects would be moved when I wasn't looking, and the whispers in the woods grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of soft footsteps pacing outside my window. When I went to check, there was nothing. Just the same empty stretch of forest, as quiet as ever. It wasn't until I returned to the house one afternoon to find my door wide open again that I realized I couldn't stay any longer. Whatever was in that house, whatever was lurking just beyond the edges of my perception, wasn't going to let me leave in peace. I packed up what little I had left, determined to get out for good. As I was about to leave, I decided to speak with Margaret one last time. She had always been a bit of an enigma, but I figured she might have some insight into the strange happenings. Maybe she could explain what was going on with the house. I walked over to her cottage, which wasn't far from mine. The door was open, but as I stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The room was dim, lit only by the fading light of the afternoon. Margaret sat in her rocking chair by the window, staring out into the woods. "Margaret," I called, but she didn't respond. I walked over to her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She turned her head slowly, her eyes hollow and vacant. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "It's not safe. They're watching you." I backed away, confusion flooding me. "Who is? What do you mean?" Her lips quivered as she spoke. "The ones who lived there before. They never left." Before I could ask more, she reached out and grabbed my wrist with a grip that was unnaturally strong. "You need to leave, before it's too late." Fear coursed through me, but I pulled free from her grip. "What are you talking about?" Margaret's eyes shifted to something behind me, and her face went pale. I turned around quickly, but nothing was there. Just the empty room, the same as it had been when I entered. "You've already seen it, haven't you?" she said softly. "The man in the woods, he's the one who watches. He's the one who waits." I stood frozen, staring at her in disbelief. "What do you mean? I don't understand." Her voice grew weaker, strained. "He never leaves. And when he decides, he takes what he wants." With that, she collapsed back into her chair, as though the life had drained out of her. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know whether to believe her or to run as fast as I could from that place. But the truth is, I didn't need to wait long to find out. That night, I packed up my things once more and left the house behind, not knowing if I'd ever feel safe again. What I had experienced in that house was beyond anything I could explain, and I knew deep down that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could imagine. But even now, years later, I still feel the pull of that house, that place where something ancient and terrible lurks just beyond the trees, waiting for the next person to come along and let it in. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
I never thought much of the small town my aunt lived in, a sleepy little place tucked away in the mountains where nothing exciting ever happened. The kind of place you read about in books and imagine from movies. Quiet, isolated, and seemingly untouched by time. It wasn't until I spent the summer there that I realized there was something darker beneath the town's peaceful exterior. It was the summer after I graduated college, and my aunt, who had always been a second mother to me, invited me to spend some time with her. I was in between jobs and needed a break from the busy city life, so I figured it would be a good opportunity to relax and clear my head. Her house was older than any place I'd ever been, a sprawling 2-story farmhouse on the edge of town. The air was always thick with the scent of pine trees, and the chirping of crickets filled the night. The windows were large, offering a view of the dense forest that bordered the property, and the house was surrounded by a garden with overgrown roses and ivy creeping up the sides. It had a certain charm to it, an old-world charm that made me feel like I had stepped into another era. The first few days were peaceful. My Aunt Linda was a kind, warm-hearted woman with a gentle spirit. We spent our days walking around the town, visiting the small local shops, and chatting with the neighbors. Everyone I met seemed friendly, although there was an odd sense of detachment in their eyes. They smiled at me politely, but there was something about their expressions that made me feel uneasy, like they were holding back something they didn't want to share. One afternoon, after I had been there for about a week, Aunt Linda and I decided to take a walk in the woods behind her house. It was a bright, sunny day, but the further we walked, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves seemed to fade away, and the only noise I could hear was the crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor. "You know, these woods have a strange history," Aunt Linda said, breaking the silence. "The locals used to say there was something strange about them, but no one ever talked about it openly." I raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" "Oh, just strange things happening. People disappearing, strange lights in the woods at night, things like that. But you know how it is. Small town gossip. People say all sorts of things." I chuckled nervously, brushing it off as just another local myth. The kind of stories that always seem to surface in small towns with too much time on their hands. We continued walking, the shadows growing longer as the sun began to dip behind the trees. My aunt told me more about the history of the town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trees seemed to be closing in around us, the once pleasant sounds of nature now replaced by an eerie silence. We made our way deeper into the forest until we came to a clearing with an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, the wood rotting and the windows shattered. It had clearly been there for years, maybe decades. Aunt Linda stopped in her tracks when she saw it, her face turning pale. "That's the cabin," she whispered, almost to herself. I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "That's where it all started," she said, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? What started?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped back, almost as if she was reluctant to go any closer to the cabin. I followed her lead, unsure of what was happening. I could feel a strange tension in the air, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. My curiosity got the best of me, and I approached the cabin on my own, stepping over the fallen branches and brush that surrounded it. As I got closer, I noticed strange markings carved into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize. The door was slightly ajar, and I couldn't help but push it open, my heart racing in my chest. The inside was dark, the air musty and stale. I could barely see anything, but I could feel something, a presence, lingering in the shadows, watching me. Before I could step any further inside, I heard my aunt's voice behind me, panicked. "Don't go in there. You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." I turned around, startled by the fear in her voice. She was standing a few feet away, her hands wringing together nervously. "Aunt Linda, what's going on? What is this place?" Her eyes darted to the cabin, and for a moment she looked almost afraid. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, as though the words were too painful to say. Instead, she grabbed my arm and pulled me away, urging me to leave the clearing. "We need to go back home. Now." I was too confused to argue, so I followed her back to the house, my mind racing with questions. What had she meant when she said it was not safe? What was it about the cabin that scared her so much? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the cabin and the strange symbols on the walls. I felt like I needed to know more, to understand what had happened there. There was something about it that felt wrong, as though something had happened in that place that was never meant to be uncovered. I decided to confront Aunt Linda the next day to ask her directly what had happened. I needed to know the truth. At breakfast, I sat across from her, watching as she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. The silence between us felt thick, and I could tell she was avoiding my gaze. "Aunt Linda, what happened at the cabin?" I asked gently. "What are you afraid of?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with sorrow. "It's not something I can explain easily, dear," she said quietly. "But I'll tell you what I know. It's better that you understand the truth." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Years ago, long before I moved here, a family lived in that cabin. A man, his wife, and their 2 children. They were good people, quiet but friendly enough. But then, strange things started happening. They would hear things at night, footsteps in the woods, whispers just outside their windows. The children would talk about an imaginary friend, someone they said lived in the forest. They would draw pictures of it, but they never showed anyone what they looked like. They just say it had big dark eyes." My stomach churned as I listened. The way she spoke made it sound like something out of a horror story. I could barely believe it. "One night, the whole family just disappeared," Aunt Linda continued. "No one saw or heard anything. The house was empty, the food still on the table, the lights still on. The police never found any trace of them. It was like they had just vanished." "Did anyone ever find out what happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Aunt Linda shook her head. "No. But after that, the strange things started happening more frequently in town. People hearing noises in the woods, like lights in the sky at night. And those symbols, they've been around for as long as I can remember. The ones you saw on the cabin, they've always been there. No one knows who put them there, but they say if you disturb them, something will happen. Something bad." I felt a chill run down my spine. What had I gotten myself into? The rest of the summer passed in a blur, but my aunt's warning stayed with me. I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong, that the town was hiding something. Late at night, I'd hear strange noises, scraping sounds, soft whispers coming from the woods. Sometimes I thought I saw shadows moving just beyond the trees. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sunset, I saw something strange. A light flickering in the distance, deep in the forest. It was too far away to be a flashlight, and it wasn't the glow of a campfire. It looked like a flickering, unnatural flame, moving in ways that didn't make sense. Before I could react, the light disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me, and then I heard it. A soft whisper, so faint that I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again. A voice, low and distant, calling my name. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing. The house was still. The voice had faded away. I never stayed in that house for another night. The next day, I packed my things and left. And though my aunt tried to convince me to stay, I knew I couldn't. There was something in that town, something in those woods, that I couldn't escape. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the dense trees behind my aunt's house. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving between the trunks, something tall and dark, with eyes that glowed in the fading light. I've never been back. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I moved into the house in late autumn, at the height of the season when the trees were shedding their leaves, the wind was sharp, and the nights grew longer. It was the kind of house people looked at with curiosity, set back from the road, surrounded by dense trees, an old structure that seemed to have weathered years of neglect. The kind of place that could seem beautiful to someone with an appreciation for the eerie, or downright unsettling to someone who didn't. I wasn't sure which one I was at first. The house was old, but not in a charming way. It had a long history, with a string of previous owners who'd all moved out in a hurry for one reason or another. I'd never thought much of it when I was initially browsing for a place to rent, but when I saw it, I immediately felt like I needed it. The price was reasonable, and I was ready for a new chapter in my life. No more roommates, no more cramped apartments. I was ready for a quiet, independent life. The landlord, a middle-aged man named Leonard, didn't seem too concerned about the place being vacant for so long. He mentioned that the house had a history and that people often found it hard to get settled in the first few weeks. But he assured me that if I had any issues, I could call him. I took the key and left. As I moved in, I noticed something strange about the place. The floors creaked underfoot, not in a charming, rustic way, but in an unnerving, almost intentional manner. It was like the house was warning me that it knew I was there. The first night was calm, relatively speaking. I spent the evening unpacking and getting situated. The house smelled old, like wood and dust, but it wasn't unpleasant. I put together a quick dinner and watched a movie on my laptop before heading to bed. But when I climbed into bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps outside my door. Light, measured steps that seemed deliberate, like someone was pacing the hallway just out of sight. I convinced myself that it was just the house settling. Old homes had that way about them. They sighed and groaned as they adjusted to the changing temperature. I tried to dismiss the feeling, but the noise persisted. Slow, steady, deliberate. I sat up, listening intently. The sound stopped, and the house went silent again. After what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to drift off to sleep. The next day, I ventured out into the woods behind the house, trying to familiarize myself with the area. The property was large, and the trees had a strange density to them, as though they had grown wild and untamed over the years. I could see the remnants of old trails, faint paths overgrown with weeds. There was something about the trees, though, something unsettling about the way they seemed to press in on the land, like they were enclosing me, watching me. By the time I returned to the house, the sun was low in the sky, and a chill had settled in. I stepped inside and immediately felt that odd sense of being watched again. I couldn't shake the feeling, and it started to make me uneasy. I spent the evening in the kitchen, cooking a meal for myself. As I worked, I noticed that the floorboards creaked beneath me, almost as if someone was walking just behind me. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was. It was then that I noticed something strange. In the corner of the kitchen, near the doorway to the living room, a chair sat tilted slightly to one side. It was an old wooden chair that I had left in its place earlier in the day, but now it was askew, as though someone had brushed against it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. No one had been in here except me. The door had been closed. There was no logical explanation for the chair being moved. I chalked it up to my own imagination. I had been living alone for a while, and the isolation was probably starting to get to me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I could hear the sound again, the faint footsteps outside my door. This time, I didn't pretend it was the house settling. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps were deliberate. They came closer, stopped just outside my door, and then silence. I felt paralyzed, as if the air itself had thickened. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I waited for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I went downstairs and noticed that the kitchen chair had moved again. It wasn't as far as the night before, but it had definitely shifted. This time, I couldn't ignore it. There was no way I had accidentally knocked it over while cooking. The house was beginning to feel alive, and it wasn't in a good way. That evening, I took a walk to try to clear my head. I needed some fresh air and to break the pattern of increasing paranoia that had been building since I moved in. As I walked through the woods, I heard something rustling behind me, branches snapping, the sound of footsteps crunching over dried leaves. I turned around quickly, but saw nothing but the empty stretch of path behind me. Still, the unsettling feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me. I quickened my pace, making my way back to the house. When I reached the front door, I was almost relieved to step inside. But the moment I did, the feeling returned. The house felt wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a knock at the door. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Knock, knock. I froze. I was alone. No one should have been at the door. My heart raced as I lay there in the darkness, listening. The knocking continued, rhythmic and persistent. Knock, knock, knock. I slowly got out of bed, my legs trembling. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. I checked through the peephole, but there was nothing. The porch was empty. Confused, I opened the door and stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin, but there was no one there. Just the night, silent and still. I stepped back inside, my mind racing. There was no way I could have imagined the knocking. I was certain I heard it. Over the next few days, things grew worse. Objects would disappear from their places, only to turn up in strange spots. My phone would ring, but when I answered, there would be only silence on the other end. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was lurking just outside my sight. One evening, I decided to call Leonard, the landlord. I had to know if there was something about the house that I didn't understand. Maybe there was an explanation for all the strange occurrences. When I called, his voice was strained, as if he had been expecting my call. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have told you sooner, but you need to leave. The house, it's not safe. It's not just the house itself, it's the land. Something happened there a long time ago. People have gone missing in that area, and no one has ever come back." I felt a chill sweep through me. "What do you mean? Missing?" Leonard was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. His voice was barely a whisper. "You're not the first person to feel it. There's something in the woods, something that doesn't let people leave, something that watches." The line went dead. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know if Leonard was just trying to scare me off or if he was being truthful. But one thing was certain. I couldn't stay there any longer. The last night in the house, I couldn't sleep. The sounds outside the door were constant, like footsteps pacing the hall, growing louder and closer. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something watching me from the darkness. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I don't know what was in that house or in those woods, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was is still waiting for me. I haven't been back since. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The storm had come out of nowhere. One moment, the sky was clear and bright, and the next, dark clouds swept in from the horizon. By the time Ella had reached her old family home, the first gusts of wind had begun to blow fiercely. The rain lashed against the windows as the storm intensified, rattling the old house that had been left abandoned for years. The house, tucked away at the edge of a small town, had belonged to her grandparents. After they passed away, it was left to her mother, and after her mother's death, Ella was the only one left to care for it. She had no real desire to keep it, but as the days passed, she found herself returning more often than she thought she would. It was the only place left that held any memory of her childhood. The house wasn't anything grand, just a small 2-story cottage that sat on a hill with an overgrown garden that her mother used to tend. The front door creaked when she pushed it open, and the scent of dust and old wood greeted her like an old friend. She had turned the lights on when she entered, but the flickering bulbs added an eerie quality to the home. It was the kind of house that made you feel as though someone else might be watching you from the shadows. But, of course, that was just her imagination. She was alone. The storm had become more intense as she went about her usual routine, checking the doors and windows, ensuring everything was in place. Ella had planned to stay only for the night to sort through a few things in the attic, but as the hours passed, the storm raged harder. The wind howled outside, and the trees, which once seemed so gentle and comforting, now looked like twisted, gnarled fingers scratching at the glass. It wasn't until the lights flickered off completely that the unease settled deeper into her chest. "Great," Ella muttered under her breath. "Power's out." She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen and turned it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The old house seemed to grow quieter with the loss of electricity, and the wind's howl sounded like a chorus of voices just beyond the windows. She climbed the stairs to the attic, the creaking of the floorboards seeming unusually loud in the silence. The attic was small and cramped, full of boxes that were covered in dust. Ella moved the boxes aside, pulling out old photos, letters, and knickknacks that her grandparents had left behind. There were memories in every corner of the attic, some pleasant, others not so much. She paused when she came across an old wooden chest, one she didn't remember ever seeing before. It had a rusty lock, and there were strange markings etched into the surface, symbols she didn't recognize. Curious, Ella tried to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. After a few attempts, she gave up and set the chest aside. The storm outside continued to roar, and Ella's unease only grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about this house, like there was something waiting, something that didn't belong. As she sifted through the other items, Ella came across an old letter, yellowed with age. It was from her mother, written when Ella was a child. The letter was dated back to when Ella had first gone away to college, a time when she and her mother hadn't been as close. The words were simple, a message of love and longing, but there was a line at the end that struck her as strange. "Don't forget what we've always known about the house." What did that mean? Ella had never heard her mother mention anything strange about the house, but it was there, in her handwriting, a cryptic warning that didn't make sense. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Suddenly, the wind howled even louder, rattling the attic window with an unsettling force. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, everything seemed to go black. When the light returned, Ella froze. Standing in the corner of the attic was a figure. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the boxes. But the figure was too distinct, too real. It was a man, his form blurry and indistinct in the dim light. He was tall, hunched over as though he'd been standing there for a long time, watching. Ella's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stood frozen, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its presence. It was like the air around her thickened, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The sound of her own pulse echoed in her ears. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly faded, as though the shadows had swallowed him up. The attic was empty again. The only sound was the wind outside, still howling with fury. Ella blinked, rubbing her eyes in disbelief. She turned the flashlight around the room, trying to convince herself that it was just a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Shaking, she hurried back downstairs, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The house felt oppressive now, the walls closing in around her. She needed to get out, but the storm had grown too fierce. There was no way she could drive in this weather. So she did what anyone would do. She went to bed. But as she lay there in the darkness, the feeling that she wasn't alone in the house refused to leave. She could hear the creaks of the house, the soft shuffle of footsteps on the floor above her, and the occasional scratch of nails against the walls. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the presence, like someone or something was watching her. The wind had died down by morning and the sky had cleared, but the unease lingered. Ella decided to stay a little longer to sort through the remaining boxes. She told herself that the figure she had seen was just a trick of her tired mind, a product of the storm and the isolation. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. That afternoon, she found a journal hidden beneath one of the boxes. It was old, the leather cover worn with age. It belonged to her grandmother. As she flipped through the pages, Ella found strange entries, some written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. There were mentions of strange occurrences in the house, noises in the night, lights flickering for no reason, and a feeling of being watched. But one entry stood out above the rest. "The man in the attic comes again. He watches when the storm comes, and when the rain falls, he whispers to me. He wants to be let out, but I cannot. I cannot let him out." Ella's heart raced as she read those words. She remembered the figure she had seen, standing in the corner of the attic. She had thought it was a hallucination, but now she wasn't so sure. Her grandmother had written about the man. Had he been here all along, waiting? That night, Ella couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, made her feel like the figure was close. She heard the scratching again. This time, it was louder, coming from the attic. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know what was going on. With trembling hands, she grabbed the flashlight and made her way to the stairs. The attic door was just above her, And as she ascended, the air seemed to grow colder. Her breath came in short gasps, her footsteps sounding too loud in the silence. When she reached the top, she hesitated, the flashlight shaking in her hand. The attic door was slightly ajar, as though someone had been there recently. She pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest. There was nothing at first, just the same dusty old boxes and forgotten relics of the past. But then she saw it. The chest, the one she had tried to open earlier, was now standing upright in the middle of the floor, its rusty lock hanging open. The room grew colder. The air felt thick, heavy with something she couldn't name. And then, from the far corner, she heard it. A voice. Soft at first, then louder, as though it was calling to her from the shadows. "Let me out." Ella froze, her blood turning to ice. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She could hear it now, clearer than ever. The voice was coming from the chest. She didn't dare approach it. She couldn't. The figure from before, the one she thought was gone, had returned. She could feel his presence in the room with her, like a dark cloud hovering just over her shoulder. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Let me out. Let me out. Now." Without thinking, Ella turned and ran. She didn't stop until she reached the bottom of the stairs, her body trembling from head to toe. She slammed the door behind her, locking it, and sank to the floor, gasping for breath. The house was silent again, but Ella knew one thing for certain. The man in the attic wasn't gone, and he wasn't going to let her leave without him. Story the end.